Meshuggah, 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 Meshuggah. Welcome. This ambitious video will pick up where the last in this series left off and cover 4 more riff sections in the next 3 minutes of this monster of a track. First, there's this riff, which in my opinion is the hardest riff on the album to play. Then there's this one, which is one of my favorite deep cut gems on this entire album. Then there is a droning return to the thematic rhythmic pattern from the start of this track. And then there's the triumphant return of one of the riffs from the previous track. That's a zoomed out map. Let's take a closer look. So first, this riff that I said was the hardest to play on the whole album. There are serpently plenty of difficult riffs on the album. So what makes this one stand out? I think the answer lies mainly in the fact that it's both patternless in pitch and patternless in rhythm simultaneously. I've made a big deal about patternlessness in the last few videos, but the 2 big examples we've seen so far have either had non-repeating rhythms with predictable pitch material, like the main riff in Death Is Life, or they had non-repeating pitches but repeating rhythms, like the first riff of In Death Is Death. This riff has non-repeating rhythms and non-repeating pitch material at the same time. The rhythms go like this. When I was practicing this, I found it easiest to think in terms of how many long attacks, so those are the dotted eighth notes, there are in a row before a string of short attacks starts. So the short attacks are the eighth notes. And then how many of the short attacks there are before we go back to the long attacks. This gives this pattern, which is yet another cool way of using numbers to represent things in Meshuggah's music. This is another version of that thing I call Meshuggah counting, where you're counting types of attacks rather than the durations of these attacks. And this string of rhythms, say it with me, is tantalizingly close to following some patterns, but it has enough disruptions that it doesn't quite work. And of course, all of this is still skating over the top of that persistent 4/4 background meter. Pitch is even trickier here, I think. We're still only using the 9 fret locations that we've used so far on this track. So the first 4 frets on the 6th and 8th strings, plus the open 8th string. But other than that, I can't see any constraints or patterns on how they choose to move between these different pitches. There are no nice hidden fretboard X's, and there's not even a consistent pattern of low, high, like there was in the first riff. There are, again, little fragments that seem to repeat, but I can't find any overarching order in this angular thicket. This patternlessness in both pitch and rhythm is really tricky. When only pitch or only rhythm is chaotic, you can at least kind of automate the other one and have a better chance of memorizing or at least tracking the patternless one. When both are non-repeating and unpredictable, it's like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time, except much harder, like if you had to sight read different types of movements with each hand at the same time. These two types of unpredictability compound each other too. The patternlessness of the pitches makes it so sometimes the strings of long attacks start on the low 8th string, and sometimes they start on the higher 6th string. The same goes for the short attacks. I find this adds quite a lot to the difficulty of hearing and playing this section. And while I'm talking about fretboard stuff, I should mention that a lot of these are real tongue twisters for your fingers in a purely physical sense. There are a few spots where you have to think several notes ahead when you're choosing which finger to use in order to avoid an awkward jump or crossing when moving to the other string on the same fret or something like that later on in the phrase. Very tricky. I'm sure I could memorize it if I spent a little more time with it, but it does seem like this passage is kind of designed to be about as hard to memorize as possible. And all of these reasons are why I humbly submit this passage as the leading contender for most difficult riff on the album, at least so far. Really, this riff section has two parts. There's this long chaotic part that I just talked about, and then a kind of seamless transition into a much more orderly repeating section. The repeating part of this riff is built of blocks that even last for 4 measures of 4/4, so they feel really orderly compared to what came before. We get a taste of this in the last bit of the non-repeating part of this riff, and then we go into the repeating part proper, marked by a change in the drums. I think it feels nice to feel like we're on firm ground again here after some really difficult, unpredictable stuff. But of course, because this is Meshuggah, things aren't exactly as simple as they seem. This repeating riff feels to me like it starts here on this note, which is an interpretation that is helped by it being a note on the low string and being the start of a sequence of a bunch of long attacks, and by the fact that it's at this point that the drums change in the recording when we move into the repeating section. However, hypermetrically speaking, this is actually wrong. What I'm feeling as beat 1 of this repeating pattern is actually beat 2. This is confirmed at the end of the repeating section when it moves into the next riff a bit earlier than you would expect, and if you track the hypermeter through the rest of the section, you'll come to the same conclusion. So it kind of feels like there's this very subtle, large-scale offset dissonance if we're listening carefully. But as always, Meshuggah comes through and shows that, as far as they're concerned, at least so far on this album, hypermeasure is inviolable. And if you're paying less careful attention, it means that the end of the repeating section feels like it comes a little bit early. That brings us to one of the true gems of this album, this bendy, twisted sounding riff. Conceptually, the shape of this is pretty straightforward. We get one thing, a longer thing, and then an even longer thing. And we keep looping through this additive shape, as always phasing against the backbeat. So in a lot of ways, this is the most straightforward Meshuggah riff that we've heard in a while on this album. There's both a repeating pitch and rhythm pattern, and it has a familiar conceptual shape. I think it sounds so cool, though, for two main reasons. For one, this basic conceptual shape is fleshed out in such a bizarre way. When you look at the actual rhythms they use and how it sits against the backbeat, the shape becomes a lot less clear. The other reason is that I think the pitch bends are doing something cool, cross-modally speaking. There's a lot of cool cognitive research being applied to music about the idea that the different senses aren't kept separate. Instead, they all blend together when your brain is kind of putting together an impression of something. That's why, for example, seeing Meshuggah's light show can have a dramatic impact on how we hear and what we pay attention to when we hear. Here, I'm arguing, very casually, for something similar, but where pitch character is affecting what we think about rhythm. I think that the bending of the pitches kind of makes it sound like time is bending too. This riff kind of melts by way of a seamless transition into the next riff section, which brings back the track's thematic rhythmic pattern and provides a dramatic juxtaposition to the chaos of some of the other riffs we've heard so far. So this little patch feels much more like the static, repetitive sections that we heard a lot more often earlier on the album. There is one cool detail here, though, about the moving bass note. It's something I didn't really pay attention to until I started playing these songs on guitar, but the lower note in this pattern is moving back and forth between root notes a minor third apart, which makes it kind of a simple version of an isorhythm. So pitch is moving with a different pattern than the rhythms are. It also plays into some of the harmonic themes we've been tracking on this album. Because this minor third bass motion recalls the third Z world of In Death Is Life, while the interval between each of the bass notes and the unchanging upper note switches between a minor second and a major second, give or take an octave, recalling the very second Z character of most of the album before that. And finally, to finish this video, we get the triumphant return of that riff from the previous track, repeated verbatim. This is the moment that will make you say that without a doubt. In Death Is Death is In Death Is Life. This is the first and one of very few of these types of returns on this album. We got some repeated riffs in the first several tracks, but never with so much different stuff in between. Here's this whole very dense section. Well, I think that's it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being you. See ya.